Her words hit Malik like a blow. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about every person who had ever suffered under the weight of systemic oppression, every person who had ever been humiliated and silenced by those who held power. Zaria had experienced the violence of racism firsthand, and if he didn't fight back, what kind of message would that send to her, to others like her? Malik leaned back in his chair, his hand running through his hair as he thought about what needed to be done. His first instinct was to pull strings, to use his position as a judge to take down the officer, to make sure he faced consequences. But he also knew that simply punishing the officer wouldn't be enough. There were larger issues at play, issues that ran deep within the entire justice system. Malik's years in the courtroom had shown him that the law was often a weapon used by those in power to protect their own interests, not to serve justice. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that what had happened to Zaria wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something far deeper. A racial divide that permeated every institution, every level of society. If he wanted to truly make a difference, he would have to take on not just the officer, but the entire system. But the stakes were high. Malik knew that challenging the status quo meant putting everything on the line. His career, his reputation, even his safety could be compromised. He wasn't naive. He understood the risks all too well. He had fought against corruption in the courtroom, but he had never faced an adversary quite like this, one that was so entrenched in the very fabric of the system. Zaria, sensing her father's hesitation, took a deep breath. "Dad, we can't let this go. We can't just sit back and let them win." Her words were steady, strong, and full of determination. "I don't want to be just another story. I want people to know what happened. I want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did." Malik looked at his daughter, feeling a mixture of pride and guilt. She was stronger than he had been at her age, more aware of the injustices that existed around them. He had always tried to shield her from the worst parts of the world, but now, it seemed like there was no escaping it. She was already in the fight, whether he was ready or not. "I'll support you, Zaria," Malik said quietly, his voice filled with resolve. "But this fight won't be easy. We need to be prepared for the backlash. There are people who will try to discredit us, to silence us, but we have to stand our ground." Zaria nodded, the fire in her eyes burning even brighter. She wasn't afraid of the fight. In fact, it felt like the only option left. If they didn't speak up now, it would be as if nothing had ever happened. They would fade into the background. Just another forgotten victim of a system designed to ignore them. But if they spoke up, if they fought back, they could make their voices heard. But there was something else. Zaria couldn't shake the feeling that the officer's actions weren't just personal. They were part of something larger. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that there had to be other victims out there, other families who had suffered under the same oppressive system. She needed to know if this officer had acted alone, or if there were others like him, others who had used their positions of power to harm and intimidate people like her. The tension between father and daughter only grew as they faced the enormous task ahead. They had no idea how the world would respond, but they knew one thing: the fight had only just begun. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of urgency. Malik couldn't stop thinking about the letter. The system had failed again, and he was left feeling cornered, unsure of how to fight back. Each night, as the world outside fell silent, his mind raced. The more he thought about the department's response, the more he realized that this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight to expose the deep-rooted corruption that tainted every corner of law enforcement. It wasn't about one officer, it was about a culture that protected and justified brutality at every turn. Zaria's frustration mirrored his own. The young woman who had once been so confident and sure now found herself fighting an invisible battle that stretched far beyond what she had imagined. Every time she scrolled through her social media, there were posts calling her a liar, questioning her integrity. Those who claimed to support her seemed to fade into silence when it became clear that the fight wasn't going to be easy. Yet, Zaria refused to back down. Every time she saw her father struggle with what to do next, it only fueled her determination. She couldn't let this moment pass. She couldn't let it slip away as if nothing had happened. It was a day like any other, until it wasn't. As the sun set on the quiet suburban neighborhood, a shocking moment would unfold that would alter the lives of those involved forever. A black girl, no older than 16, stood in the middle of a police station, her hands trembling as she tried to hold back the tears. In front of her, an officer with a hardened expression held a pair of clippers in his hand, ready to take away her dignity. The officer's voice was cold, mocking as he began to shave her head, all while her father, standing just a few feet away, helplessly watched. But what neither the officer nor the girl realized at that moment was that her father was not just a regular man, he was a judge, and this small act of humiliation would spark a firestorm of consequences no one could have predicted. The tension in the room was palpable as the clippers buzzed, each pass cutting deeper into the girl's confidence and her sense of self. Her father's eyes locked with the officer's, his gaze icy, but still he said nothing. He couldn't, not yet. The officer, oblivious to the true identity of the man standing before him, believed he had complete control. He thought his badge would shield him from any repercussions for his actions, and in that moment he reveled in the power he held. But little did he know, his mistake would soon be his downfall. What started as a cruel, racially charged act of humiliation would snowball into a scandal that would rock the very foundations of the police force and the justice system. The girl, who had grown up in a world where she already faced daily battles against prejudice and bias, stood in shock. She had been brought in by the officers for reasons that felt unjust to her from the start, but the final insult, the shaving of her hair, was an act she could never have imagined. Her father, though a man of immense authority in the courtroom, stood there powerless, unable to stop the officer's cruel action. It was a moment of deep humiliation for the girl, a traumatic experience that would stay with her for years to come. But in those quiet, unbearable moments, her father's mind was working overtime. As a judge, he had seen the worst of humanity, and yet nothing had prepared him for this. As a black man in a position of power, he had fought tirelessly to earn his place in a system that had never been built with him in mind. But now, standing in this police station, he realized he was facing an entirely new kind of battle. A battle for his daughter's dignity, for justice, and ultimately, for his own identity as a man and a father. What the officer didn't realize was that this incident would set off a chain of events he couldn't have imagined. The power dynamics he took for granted were about to be shattered. And the moment he stepped outside the confines of his authority to humiliate an innocent girl, he had just opened a door that would lead to the very unraveling of the system he believed he controlled. Her father's blood boiled as he watched his daughter's once beautiful hair fall to the floor, a symbol of something far greater than just the girl's appearance. It was an act of control, of racial power. And in that moment, he knew that this wasn't just about his daughter's humiliation anymore. This was about sending a message. As the girl's hair fell to the floor in uneven clumps, the officer seemed satisfied, stepping back with an air of finality, unaware that the man he had just humiliated was someone who could, and would, change everything. The girl stood there, her head exposed and raw from the clippers, her face a mixture of disbelief and shame. But even in the middle of this traumatic event, something inside her began to shift. She would no longer allow herself to be a victim. And her father, a man who had spent years trying to keep his family safe from the biases of the world, had reached his breaking point. He knew that nothing would be the same after today. The days of tolerating injustice would be over. This moment, this horrible, cruel act, would mark the beginning of something far larger than any of them could comprehend. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. In the following moments, as father and daughter walked out of that station, their lives would change irrevocably. The officer's actions would not go unpunished, and the story of the judge and his daughter would unfold in ways that no one, least of all the officer, could have anticipated. What began as an act of racism in a small police station would soon become a flashpoint for larger conversations about power, justice, and the consequences of unchecked authority. But what happens next? How will this father, a judge who has worked for years to navigate the corrupt and biased systems, now fight against the very forces he once served? What kind of justice will this girl receive, and will the officer face the consequences for what he has done? The clock is ticking, and the tension is rising. The story is far from over. This's father and daughter left the station, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on them. Malik, the judge, could feel his pulse racing. His mind was racing even faster, replaying the scene over and over again. His daughter, Zaria, had just been humiliated in the worst way possible, her head shaved in front of him like some grotesque act of power. And yet, what had struck him most wasn't the physical violence of the moment, but the insidious, calculated cruelty behind it. It wasn't just about her hair. It was about control, about stripping her of her dignity in front of the one person who was supposed to protect her. Zaria, though only 16, was wise beyond her years. She had seen enough of the world to know that being black in America often meant being treated differently, being seen as less than, but she had never experienced anything like this. The officer's words echoed in her mind, each one cutting deeper than the clippers ever could. You think you're special just because your dad's a judge? Look where you are. Look at who we are. They were words of power, meant to humiliate her and remind her of her place. But as she stood there, her bare scalp cool in the air, she didn't feel like the victim. She felt something else, a spark, a quiet fire stirring inside her. Her father's protective nature had always been there, but today, something was different. He wasn't just angry, he was enraged. The man who had spent his career in the justice system, navigating its complexities and working tirelessly to uphold fairness, now found himself faced with a situation where justice seemed impossible. The officer's actions were an affront not just to Zaria, but to everything he had fought for as a judge. The system that he had once believed in had turned against him in the most personal way possible, and there was no ignoring it. They didn't speak much as they drove away from the station. Malik's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his thoughts swirling in a maelstrom of confusion, fury, and fear for his daughter. Zaria stared out the window, her emotions too complicated to articulate. She could feel the anger radiating from her father, but also a deep sadness. For all his wisdom and authority, he was helpless in this moment. This wasn't a courtroom, where his words could carry weight. This was a place where power was measured in badges and guns, and the lines of justice had been blurred beyond recognition. As they drove through the city streets, Malik's mind kept circling back to one thought. What was the real story behind what had happened? Why had that officer singled out Zaria? Was it just a random act of cruelty, or was there something more insidious at play? The idea that this had been a deliberate attempt to humiliate his daughter and undermine him didn't sit well. It was too coordinated, too personal. He thought back to the officer's face, his smug expression as he shaved Zaria's head, oblivious to the identity of the man standing before him. There was no hesitation in the officer's actions, no doubt. It was as if he knew exactly what he could get away with. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random act of aggression. It was part of something bigger, something tied to the very systems Malik had spent his life working within. Zaria's thoughts were equally troubled. Her father, a man of strength and integrity, had always been her hero. She'd admired his calm demeanor in the courtroom, his ability to make decisions that shaped the future of many, but now she saw him differently. She saw the cracks in the facade, the vulnerability behind the stern exterior. What had happened today wasn't just an attack on her. It was an attack on their family, on everything her father stood for. Zaria had never seen him like this before, shaken, disoriented. It made her question everything she thought she knew about the justice system, about the world in general. The ride home felt like a blur, but as they arrived at their front door, Malik paused. Zaria turned to look at him, her eyes wide, still searching for some reassurance that everything would be okay. But Malik knew the truth. The kind of world they lived in was not one that gave easy answers. There would be no quick fix, no simple resolution. What happened today was just a symptom of a much deeper problem. One that reached all the way to the heart of the system Malik had worked so hard to be a part of. Inside the house, Malik began pacing. He couldn't stay still. His mind raced with thoughts of what he should do next. He knew that going public with this incident was the right thing to do. He had connections, and he had influence. As a judge, his voice carried weight, and if he used that power to expose the truth, maybe things could change. But he also knew the risks. The backlash could be severe, not just for him, but for Zaria as well. It wasn't just the police force that he was up against. It was the entire system that had allowed people like that officer to thrive. Zaria, on the other hand, had a different perspective. She didn't want to hide. She didn't want to let this define her. She had always been a fighter, and the humiliation she had suffered today only fueled her resolve to speak out. If her father was going to stand up, she would stand with him. But what did that mean for them? Could they really take on such a powerful force? Could they expose the corruption that ran deep in the system, even if it meant losing everything? Both father and daughter were faced with a difficult decision. They had been forced into a fight they never asked for, and now their next move would determine everything. They could choose silence, return to their lives and pretend nothing had happened, or they could choose to take on the system head-on, exposing the officer's actions and the larger forces that allowed such abuse to happen. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of their choices hanging in the air. Neither knew what the right path was, but they did know one thing. They couldn't let the injustice stand. This was no longer just about hair or humiliation. This was about dignity, respect, and the pursuit of justice in a world where both could often feel impossible to attain. The fight had just begun, and neither Malik nor Zaria knew where it would lead them. But they knew one thing for sure: it would change their lives forever. It's just the beginning of a much larger battle, one that will shake the system to its very core. The days that followed were filled with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty, and the weight of that fateful day in the police station continued to haunt both Malik and Zaria. Neither could shake the image of the officer standing there, clippers in hand, and the shame that followed in his wake. Zaria tried to focus on the mundane: school, friends, distractions, but the memory kept bubbling to the surface, especially when she caught herself brushing her fingers through her hair, which now felt completely different, almost foreign. Every time she looked into the mirror, she was reminded of what had been taken from her. Malik, on the other hand, was consumed by the larger questions of how this had happened and why. His mind constantly churned through the details: the officer's nonchalance, the cruelty with which he carried out his orders. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that the officer's actions were not random. They were intentional. It wasn't just about shaming his daughter. It was about putting him in his place, making a statement. Malik had spent his life in a system that he thought he could change. A system that he had dedicated himself to, only to have that very system turn against him when it mattered most. There was an uncomfortable silence between father and daughter as they sat at the dinner table one night, the air thick with unsaid words. Malik's mind wandered, recalling the officer's earlier remarks. "You think you're special just because your dad's a judge?" The words rang in his head, almost mocking him. He had always known that the world could be cruel, especially to black families, but this was different. This wasn't just about racial profiling or injustice, it was personal. It was a slap in the face to everything he stood for. Zaria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her thoughts mirrored his. She wanted to scream at him to make everything right again, to use his influence and pull to exact some form of retribution on the officer who had done this to her. But she knew that, despite his power, the systems they were fighting were so entrenched, so deeply ingrained, that it would take more than one man, no matter how powerful, to tear them down. She had seen the way people in positions of power turned a blind eye to the suffering of those beneath them. She had watched it happen in courtrooms, in the streets, on television. She knew that even her father, a judge, could only do so much within a system that often valued power over justice. "I don't know what to do anymore," Malik muttered, his voice low as he looked at his daughter. He didn't know how to fix this, how to protect her from the world that seemed so determined to bring her down. "I want to fight, but I also know the risks. If I go public, it might hurt you. It might hurt us both." Zaria looked up at her father, her eyes unwavering. She had been through so much already. The thought of hiding or retreating from this battle felt like surrender. "But if we don't do something, then it's like it never happened. We can't just pretend it doesn't matter." The media storm was still raging, and every new headline pushed Malik further into a corner. He knew that staying quiet wasn't an option anymore. He could feel the weight of his own silence bearing down on him. As a judge, he had always been taught to stay impartial, to remain calm and collected, never letting personal emotions interfere with the law. But now, standing in the shadow of this injustice, he understood more than ever that his role wasn't just about ruling in courtrooms. His position gave him a platform to make change, to challenge the system he had long been a part of. The question was, could he do it without losing everything? The pressure of the situation began to take its toll. The phone calls became constant, the messages endless. Supporters, critics, and even members of his own circle reached out, either urging him to stay quiet or to push harder for change. But the harder Malik tried to focus on the next step, the more he found himself paralyzed by doubt. He knew that once the public knew the full extent of the story, if they could even handle it, there would be no going back. The officer who had shaved Zaria's head would no longer be the face of this injustice. The true villain would be revealed, the system itself. Malik's heart raced as he thought about the risks. Zaria was no longer just his daughter, she was a symbol of something much bigger. She had become the face of this movement, the voice for those who had been wronged. But how long could she keep speaking out when the forces aligned against her were so much stronger than she was? How long could she maintain this public stance when there was so much personal pain tied to it? And what would it do to their family if Malik went public with everything he knew? Could he truly afford to expose the rot within the justice system while knowing the consequences would stretch far beyond just his career? The weeks turned into a blur. Malik had never been so conflicted, so unsure of the future. Each decision seemed to carry with it a weight far greater than anything he had faced before. But every time he saw his daughter standing tall, despite the cruel jokes and whispered insults, his resolve grew stronger. Zaria wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away into the shadows like so many others before it. And that was when Malik finally realized what he had to do. He couldn't fight this fight alone, and he certainly couldn't let Zaria do it alone. Together, they had to confront the heart of the injustice. But what did that mean? What were the next steps? Malik made his decision in the quiet of his office one late night. He had come to understand that the fight wasn't just about a single act of cruelty. It was about exposing a pattern, a culture of abuse that was far more widespread than anyone realized. But he needed something more. He needed the support of people who weren't just talking about the issue, people who were willing to take action. The wheels of justice had always been slow, and they'd always been easier to stop than to move. But maybe, just maybe, if he used his voice and Zaria's courage, they could create a movement that could not be silenced. The tension in their lives grew as Malik and Zaria prepared for the next phase of the fight. They knew they would have to be strategic. They couldn't just act on emotion, as raw as that emotion was. This needed to be bigger than just one moment. This needed to be part of something greater. A few days later, Malik made an announcement. His voice, steady but filled with purpose, broadcasted over the airwaves, shaking the foundations of the system that had failed so many before. The moment the press conference started, there was no turning back. In front of cameras, with reporters lined up and the world watching, Malik revealed everything. The public would know about the officers' actions, but more importantly, they would know about the culture that allowed those actions to happen in the first place. The public would hear about the department's failed investigation, about the people who had tried to cover up what had happened. He didn't stop there. Malik also announced a full investigation into the wider practices of the police department, a deep dive into its history of racism and brutality, calling for transparency, accountability, and reform. Zaria stood by her father's side, her face steady despite the nerves threatening to overtake her. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was their fight, but there was no turning back now. As the cameras flashed and the reporters fired their questions, she remained silent, letting her father take the lead. He had always been her protector, her rock. And now, she was proud to stand beside him, knowing they were about to change the course of everything. But even as Malik made his bold move, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The backlash would be fierce. The challenges enormous, but the fight had already begun. Malik knew that no matter what happened, they were no longer alone. They had become part of something bigger, something that could no longer be silenced. As the press conference ended and the cameras finally turned off, the weight of what had just been set into motion began to sink in. Malik and Zaria exchanged a look. There was fear in her eyes, but there was also something else, something stronger. Something that had been born out of their pain, their rage, and their relentless drive for justice. They knew the storm was coming, but they also knew they were ready to face it head-on. The days following the press conference were a blur of headlines, public reactions, and whispers in the corridors of power. Malik and Zaria had ignited something that could not be extinguished. News outlets across the country were buzzing with the story of the police officers' actions, the failed investigation, and the judge's shocking revelation. The world had finally begun to understand the deep-seated issues plaguing the system, but just as the momentum seemed to be building in their favor, a new twist took shape that no one saw coming. It was early in the morning when Malik received the first phone call. His heart sank as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line, speaking with an urgency that felt all too familiar. The message was clear: someone close to him had made a move that would shift the power dynamics once again. An anonymous source had leaked confidential information about his past, information that could dismantle his entire credibility. It wasn't just about the case anymore. This was personal. The stakes had just been raised. The leak was a calculated blow, one that was designed to undermine everything Malik had worked for. It was a glimpse into his past, revealing a small, seemingly insignificant mistake from years ago, one that, if twisted just right, could destroy his reputation as a judge and as a man of integrity. The implications were clear. The establishment was using his own history against him, hoping to discredit him before he could bring about any real change. But there was more to it than just this. The timing was too perfect. It was as if someone knew exactly when and where to strike. Malik felt the weight of the revelation crash down on him. The room felt smaller, suffocating. He had always kept his past behind him, buried in the shadows where it couldn't harm him. He had worked so hard to build a career that demanded respect, a legacy that stood for justice. But now, the past was coming back to haunt him in the worst possible way. His enemies had found their leverage, and they weren't about to let it go. Zaria, too, felt the sting of the new twist. She had stood beside her father with unwavering support, but now she could see the toll it was taking on him. Her father, the man who had always been a pillar of strength, now seemed vulnerable. The weight of the world was bearing down on them, and she feared that the cracks in their fight for justice might begin to show. What if the leak wasn't just an attack on her father's reputation, but a calculated attempt to derail the entire movement? What if this was just the beginning of a larger, more sinister strategy to crush the very cause they had been fighting for? In the days that followed, the media became even more vicious. The leaked information was analyzed, scrutinized, and twisted in every possible direction. Articles appeared questioning Malik's fitness for office, suggesting that his past mistakes made him unworthy to lead the charge for justice. Public opinion began to shift. People who had once supported him began to question whether they had placed their faith in the right person. The relentless barrage of negative press was starting to take its toll. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, a more chilling development began to unfold. Zaria received a threatening message. It was vague, but the message was clear enough. You should have stayed silent. Your father won't be able to protect you now. The anonymous nature of the threat only added to its power. Someone was out there, watching their every move, and they were willing to go to great lengths to silence them. Zaria showed the message to Malik, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. She wasn't going to let this stop her. She had already come too far, but Malik could feel the walls closing in on them. The message was a reminder of just how dangerous this fight had become. The pressure grew, pushing both Malik and Zaria to their limits. They found themselves caught between the desire to continue the fight for justice and the overwhelming fear of what it would cost them. Malik knew that the stakes were higher than ever before, but he also knew that backing down wasn't an option. Zaria's courage fueled his resolve, but even so, the threat to their safety loomed large. The plot had thickened, and Malik realized that the fight for justice was no longer just about exposing one officer or one department. It was about taking down a system that had been entrenched for years, a system that would stop at nothing to protect its own. And the more he dug, the more he uncovered the layers of corruption that reigned deep within the institution. The police force, the political figures, the powerful figures who stood behind them. They were all connected, and they were all trying to protect their own interests. The stakes had never been higher. Malik began to realize that he couldn't fight this battle alone. Zaria's bravery had already proven that she was in this with him, but it wasn't enough. They needed allies. They needed people who would stand beside them, who would lend their voices to the fight for justice. Who could they trust? With every step they took, they were met with resistance. The establishment was closing ranks, and it seemed like the harder they fought, the more the opposition dug in its heels. But even as the pressure mounted, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The forces aligned against them were powerful, but so was their cause. He had to find a way to turn the tables, to shift the momentum back in their favor. The revelation about his past had been a blow, but it wasn't the end. He still had his voice, and he still had Zaria by his side. Together, they could expose the truth and show the world the depth of the corruption they were fighting against. As the days passed, the tension between Malik and Zaria became more palpable. They both knew what was at stake, but the uncertainty of the future loomed over them. Would they be able to survive the coming storm? Could they fight against an entire system determined to protect itself? The road ahead was filled with obstacles, but one thing was certain: they couldn't stop now. The final confrontation was drawing closer, and both father and daughter knew it. The true nature of their fight had yet to fully unfold, but they were determined to see it through, no matter what the cost. The real battle was still ahead of them, and nothing, no leak, no threat, could stop them now. The final moments of the battle were fast approaching. The pressure on Malik and Zaria had become unbearable, but neither of them was willing to back down. The media's relentless attack on Malik's past had caused a fracture in public support, but it also revealed something crucial. The system was terrified of the truth getting out. What started as a personal attack on Malik had morphed into something much bigger. This was no longer just about a man's past. It was about revealing the corruption that ran through the very heart of the justice system. Malik had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, pulling together the evidence and finding those willing to risk their careers to stand with him. He had enlisted the help of trusted allies, investigators who had been following the corrupt web that connected certain officers to powerful political figures. Zaria had been instrumental too, using her platform to speak out against the system that had caused her so much pain, bringing awareness to the injustice that they were both trying to expose. But it was clear that they were up against forces much stronger than they could have imagined. And the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the stakes became. The final confrontation was set to take place in the courtrooms, where Malik would lay out his case against the police officer who had wronged Zaria, as well as the larger network of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The courtroom was filled with tension as the final day of the trial arrived. Journalists, activists, and spectators filled the seats, watching as Malik prepared to confront the very system he had dedicated his life to reforming. The defendant, Officer Harris, the same cop who had humiliated Zaria, sat in the dock, a cold and calculated look in his eyes. He was confident that the political forces behind him would protect him, that the case would be swept under the rug, just like so many before it. But Malik had other plans. Armed with irrefutable evidence, he was ready to expose the truth. As Malik began his argument, every word seemed to hit harder than the last. He spoke with a clarity and conviction that resonated through the room, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. He painted a vivid picture of a corrupt system that had allowed the abuse of power to go unchecked for far too long, how the very institutions that were meant to serve and protect were actually the ones that perpetuated harm. He didn't just focus on Officer Harris, he revealed the larger network, the connections, the cover-ups, and the systemic racism that had allowed such atrocities to take place without consequence. The room was silent as the evidence was presented: surveillance footage, testimony from whistleblowers, internal memos that showed how officers like Harris were shielded by higher-ups. Every piece of information felt like a blow to the very foundation of the justice system. The shock in the courtroom was palpable. It was clear that what Malik had uncovered was far worse than anyone had initially realized. But just as Malik thought he had the case in the bag, an unexpected twist turned everything on its head. A new piece of evidence was brought to light, one that no one had anticipated. The footage of the incident, the very event that had started this entire fight, Zaria being forced to shave her head, had been doctored. A hidden camera angle, one that had never been released to the public, revealed that the officer responsible for the attack was not just a row cop. In fact, it was revealed that this officer had been acting on orders from someone much higher up in the chain of command. The realization hit like a freight train. This wasn't just a case of one officer abusing his power. This was a coordinated effort, a calculated attack meant to send a message to those who would dare to challenge the system. Officer Harris wasn't the mastermind, he was a pawn in a much larger game. Someone within the department, someone with connections far beyond the local precinct, had orchestrated the entire incident. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the implications sank in. Who was behind the attack on Zaria, and why? As Malik processed the new revelation, he realized that this was not just a personal vendetta against him or his daughter. It was an attack on the very foundation of justice itself. The corruption ran deeper than he could have ever imagined, and the fight for truth was far from over. In the midst of the turmoil, a figure stepped forward from the back of the courtroom, an individual no one had expected to see. It was Judge Edwards, the very judge who had been overseeing the case. Everyone had assumed he was a neutral party, someone with no ties to the matter at hand. But it turned out that Judge Edwards was far more involved than anyone could have ever guessed. Judge Edwards had been in the pocket of the powerful political figures who had orchestrated the entire scheme. He had been the one to protect Officer Harris, the one who had manipulated the legal process to ensure that no one would ever get close to uncovering the truth. But now, with everything out in the open, it was clear that his days of hiding behind the law were over. In a shocking moment of accountability, Judge Edwards was arrested right there in the courtroom, his criminal actions laid bare for everyone to see. The corruption that had been allowed to fester in the system for years was finally being exposed, and those who had protected it were now being held accountable. As the dust settled, Malik and Zaria stood side by side, watching as the courtroom erupted into applause. It wasn't a victory in the traditional sense. There was still much work to be done, and the road to true justice would be long and difficult. But in that moment, they knew that they had achieved something monumental. They had taken down a corrupt system, piece by piece, and had brought those responsible to justice. The final twist had been a bitter reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. The enemy they had faced was not just a few bad apples. It was a deep-rooted system, and though they had made progress, there was still much to be done. But Malik and Zaria had proven that even in the face of unimaginable odds, the truth would always find a way to shine through. Their story had just begun, and though the road ahead would be difficult, they were ready to face it together, knowing that the fight for justice would never truly end. The courtroom settled into an eerie silence after the arrest of Judge Edwards. Everyone in the room knew this was a pivotal moment in the story of Malik and Zaria, but the true gravity of what had just transpired began to sink in only after the noise died down. Officers moved quickly to detain the corrupt judge, handcuffing him with a finality that sent a ripple of disbelief through the crowd. His expression was cold, but there was a moment, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, that hinted at his understanding of what was about to unfold. The shields he had hidden behind for so long were crumbling, and there was no way out. Malik's heart raced, his hands trembling slightly as he took a deep breath. Zaria, standing beside him, looked at her father with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. They had been through so much together, enduring the worst kinds of injustice, and yet, here they were, on the cusp of seeing a system that had been designed to oppress them begin to crack open. But even as the first signs of victory appeared on the horizon, they both knew that the fight was far from over. Outside the courtroom, reporters scrambled to gather information, their cameras flashing as they captured every moment of the unfolding drama. The truth had come out, but it wasn't just about what happened to Zaria or even Malik. It was about the larger issue, the systemic racism and corruption within law enforcement that affected countless lives every day. The arrest of Judge Edwards was symbolic, but it wasn't enough to erase the pain that so many families had endured for years, generations even. As Malik and Zaria walked down the hallway, away from the courtroom, the weight of the moment began to feel more real. The world outside had changed in a way that would be felt for years to come. Malik couldn't shake the feeling that, for all the progress made, they were only scratching the surface. The corruption ran deep, not just within law enforcement, but within the political structures that upheld it. That knowledge both fueled his drive for change and left him with a sense of unease. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Zaria, who had spent months wrestling with the trauma of what had happened to her, felt a shift within herself as well. It wasn't just about justice for her. It was about justice for everyone who had been hurt by the system, for those who didn't have a voice or the platform to speak out. In the months following the trial, she would use her experiences to fuel her activism, speaking at rallies, organizing protests, and empowering others to stand up for their rights. She knew her journey wasn't over, but she felt more ready than ever to keep fighting. Malik continued to press forward with his mission, becoming more involved in pushing for reforms within the legal system. He knew that taking down one corrupt judge wasn't enough. The ripple effect of this case had shown how deeply ingrained the corruption was within the police force, the courts, and even local government. What happened to Zaria was just one part of a much larger narrative, one that stretched across the country, one that demanded change on a massive scale. As the days turned into weeks, Malik and Zaria found themselves in the public eye more than they ever expected. They were hailed as heroes, as symbols of resistance against a corrupt system. But behind the headlines and the cameras, the weight of it all was heavy. They were constantly aware that they had become pawns in a much bigger game, one that was designed to distract from the very problems they were fighting to expose. The attention, while rewarding in some ways, also brought complications. With every victory, there were new threats, new battles to fight. For Malik, it wasn't just about holding those accountable for what had happened to his daughter. It was about creating a ripple of change in a system that had been built on the oppression of people like them. He spent late nights researching policies, speaking to activists, and attending meetings. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. Zaria, too, had moments where she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her courage had inspired so many, but she struggled with the public persona that came with it. Every time she spoke about the abuse she had endured, She had to relive those moments. She had to reconcile the girl she once was with the woman she was becoming. But as time passed, she found peace in knowing that her suffering had brought out something bigger than herself. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a voice for the voiceless, a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. Though Malik and Zaria had made significant strides, there were still many battles left to fight. The arrest of Judge Edwards was only the beginning of a much larger effort to dismantle the systems of oppression that had allowed the abuse of power to continue unchecked for so long. The people who had enabled such acts of injustice weren't going to give up easily, and Malik knew that the coming months would be filled with more obstacles and resistance than ever before. But he was undeterred. With every setback, his resolve grew stronger. In the quiet moments, when things slowed down and the demands of their newfound roles in society lessened, Malik would look at his daughter, knowing that the journey ahead was theirs to navigate. What had happened to Zaria was a tragedy, but it had also become a rallying cry. They both understood that their lives were no longer just their own. They were part of something much larger, something that could change the course of history. The final chapter of their story wasn't about finding a simple resolution, but about embracing the ongoing fight for justice. It was about creating a ripple effect that would transcend their individual struggles, one that would inspire others to take a stand, to fight for what was right, and to hold those in power accountable for their actions. As they continued to work toward a more equitable society, Malik and Zaria understood one fundamental truth: justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey, one that would require perseverance, resilience, and unity. But together, with their voices raised and their determination unwavering, they knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. And in the end, their fight wasn't just for themselves. It was for the countless others who had been silenced, whose stories had been ignored. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would continue to walk it, together, for as long as it took to make a difference.